Hello everyone, and welcome to my lecture entitled Ritual and Contagion in Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. My name is Samantha Landau, and I'm a Project Associate Professor at the University of Tokyo, Komaba campus in Tokyo, Japan. I hope my lecture will provide interesting perspectives and new directions of analysis for this novel, which is both the first Jackson novel I ever read and the novel that started me on my journey to become a professor nearly 2 decades ago. I'm grateful to the Japanese Ministry of Education for partially funding research for this presentation through their grants and aid for scientific research. Without further ado, let's get started. Shirley Jackson may need no introduction after the past several years of scholarship and the release of Ruth Franklin's award-winning biography. Though Jackson's works are rightly associated with horror and the macabre, her interpretation of the Gothic usually features no monsters or any identifiable ghosts. Instead, her fiction relies on the uncanny, on hidden transgression and evil in human nature, on unreliable narrators and mental disease. These make her works a fundamental reimagining of the Gothic, reflective of mid-20th century American social anxieties, burgeoning equality movements, and evolving ideas on psychology. We find the supernatural in her works because of her obsession with how folklore, magic, demonology, and ghosts influence our behavior, an obsession that can be found reflected throughout her oeuvre, in both her heartwarming family stories and her more serious fiction's spooky engagement with the devil or haunted houses. Jackson's novel, The Haunting of Hill House, published in 1959, is set in an old manse somewhere in the American countryside, probably Vermont. The plot centers on Eleanor, an unmarried woman who spent most of her life nursing her mother. Eleanor joins 4 other characters on an experiment to see if a certain countryside manor, called Hill House, is haunted. The others who join her are Dr. Montague, who is steering the experiment, his wife, who is obsessed with planchette and spiritualism, Theodora, a businesswoman with psychic abilities, and Luke, the nephew of Hill House's owner. Eleanor thinks she was asked to join the experiment because she experienced poltergeist phenomenon in her childhood. Stones rain down on her house. The group both explore and sleep in Hill House and try to contact the spirits with planchette, but Eleanor becomes the focus of the haunting. Because of its plot, and because the characters believe they are experiencing a haunting, Hill House is considered the most supernatural of Jackson's works, and is oft mentioned by scholars of the horror genre, though they may or may not know that Jackson did an immense amount of research on poltergeists and hauntings before she wrote the book. She also collected houses, trying to find the house with architectural specifications that would fit a house both containing spirits or contaminated on its own. Despite this background, spectral phenomena and poltergeist activity are left ambiguous in the novel. Only Eleanor, the protagonist, is sure she has seen anything, and the other characters only have strange experiences that seem both dreamlike and inexplicable. The hauntings instead take on a psychologically contagious form. They are not only formulated by the characters' interaction with their environment and each other, but also with their memories, sense of time, and behaviors. As Joyce Carol Oates has noted, in Jackson's works, especially in Hill House, quote, "There is the possibility that a toxic individual is a contagion to others and to herself," end quote. Eleanor's ritual behavior against contagion begins early in the novel. She sings songs to herself and imagines deep symbolism in various objects on her way to Hill House, such as the poison grove of oleander trees, the desire of a little girl for her cup of stars, and the protection of the stone lions in front of a house that she passes. Ironically, these behaviors seem only to increase her susceptibility to the haunting in Hill House, as they stem from her rejection of her unhappy childhood and subsequent reconstruction of what she considers the ideal image of woman. Having been socialized into a family that treated her as a convenient care worker, neither allowing her to marry nor educate herself to attain economic self-sufficiency, she was left with no skills to enter society after her mother's death, and therefore had trouble identifying herself with grown women. Eleanor's mother's unequal treatment of her children is at the root of this problem. She allowed Eleanor's sister to go out into society, while at the same time selfishly forbidding Eleanor from doing the same. Eleanor refuses to inherit her mother's anxiety, which she describes as both blind and hysterical. Eleanor also represses her hostility and antagonism towards her mother, and through her desire to journey, engages in active and ritualistic practice to separate from her mother's illness and anxiety, and to reattach to a new idea of mother and home. Psychological contagion is not limited to human beings in Jackson's fiction. It also extends to personified objects and objects that act as receptacles for memories, especially houses. In The Haunting of Hill House is both, quote, vile and, quote, diseased, Eleanor says, and then implies that the thought of the house as equivalent to an illness came from somewhere other than her conscious mind. Eleanor repeatedly asserts that the thoughts she has about Hill House come from somewhere other than herself. Perhaps they come from the house itself, or from the ghosts that inhabit it, invading her thoughts. These thoughts compel her to act on repressed impulses regarding her desire for autonomy, her sexuality, and in the end, the taking of her own life. In addition, Hill House does not follow the rules of what a house should be. Under normal circumstances, we see a house as something comforting, homely, familiar. Quoting Freud's terminology, a habitable house may be called Heimlich, coincidentally a term that literally translates to belonging to the house. But Hill House is unheimlich. Its paranormal activity and sickened state belong to the uncanny because it is the familiar image of the house warped into the unfamiliar. Dr. Montague lectures, quote, "You will recall," the doctor began, "the houses described in Leviticus as leprous, saras, or Homer's phrase for the underworld, Aidao Domos, the house of Hades. I need not remind you, I think, that the concept of certain houses as unclean or forbidden, perhaps sacred, is as old as the mind of man. Certainly there are spots which inevitably attach to themselves an atmosphere of holiness and goodness. It might not then be too fanciful to say that some houses are born bad," end quote. His words recall that haunted houses are disturbed spaces. Can we define the house itself, a supposedly inanimate object, as evil? Jackson's personification of Hill House as, quote, "not sane," a living thing with choice, indicates that that possibility does exist. In Jackson's authorial universe, evil can be created during the metamorphosis from a clean slate to an unclean one, to become forbidden territory, a liminal space where transformation occurs. In Hill House, that transformation happens for Eleanor. The house is drawn to her deep-seated fear that she will be unable to achieve economic stability on her own. Roberta Rubinstein argues that this fear causes Eleanor to not only become the progeny of the house, but to be subsumed by it. Quote, "Eleanor is progressively incorporated and infantilized by the malign powers of Hill House," end quote. These malign powers may be designated a psychological contagion. There is even a distinct theme of children present within the haunting itself, connecting Eleanor's desire to be loved as a child. The ghosts emit high-pitched giggles, bang on all of the doors in the middle of the night, entice Eleanor to sing nursery rhymes such as "In and Out the Windows" while dancing, and then finally to bang on the doors herself as if she were one of the ghost children. It is in this last scene, during which Eleanor goes about the house frightening everyone else, that it is especially clear that Eleanor has already accepted the house as her mother, and the contagion seems complete. Quote, "Mother," she said aloud, and stepped quickly back. "Come along," a voice answered distinctly upstairs, and Eleanor turned, eager, and hurried to the staircase, unquote. In the same scene, she continues along in the house until she realizes that everyone will be looking for Eleanor, and then remarks, quote, "Poor house, I had forgotten Eleanor. Now they will have to open their doors," end quote. She thinks she can feel the whole house, every inch of it, quote, curling around her ankles, and she has changed her opinion to find the house, quote, protected and warm, and even, quote, lucky. One of the significant factors that foreshadows Eleanor's contagion is her use of song as a ritual, which starts to appear at the beginning of the book when she sets off in her car to Hill House. However, the idea that Hill House will provide a more welcoming home than the one Eleanor grew up is false. Hill House is not a safe place for women. Built by a toxic patriarch, Hugh Crane, the house's dark history of dead women and betrayal between female companions belies its true nature as an instrument of the patriarchy, just as the tune that Eleanor sings to herself becomes a ritual expression of dramatic irony by the end of the novel. Instead of foreshadowing a ritual of marriage or romantic love, it foreshadows Eleanor's act of self-sacrifice, her suicide. Up to this point in Jackson's scholarship, Jackson's evocation of music as a ritualistic behavior has been overlooked. This is perhaps ironic, as it is the very problem that her husband pointed out in his seminal essays on ritual and myth, The Ritual View of Myth and the Mythic, and the Raggle-Taggle Ballads O. While Hyman asserted that no modern writers, quote, invent myths or, quote, write folk literature, he did insist that, quote, ritual or symbolic action is physically mined in literature as it is in other arts, such as dance. Further, Hyman explains that even Shakespeare based his use of folk ballads in myth. It is then not a coincidence, but perhaps an act of metafiction, that Jackson used a song, O Mistress Mine, that most readers would identify with Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Yet as a popular song in Shakespeare's day, with settings by William Byrd and Thomas Morley that predate the Twelfth Night, O Mistress Mine perfectly performs the mimic function that Hyman has indicated. With this song as the ritual touchpoint for Eleanor in her journey to and stay at Hill House, the repetition of Journey's End and Lover's Meeting becomes a tautology evocative not only of private prayer, but of Eleanor's attachment to public ritual. It reminds the reader that Eleanor's goal is a heteronormative one. She not only wants to become part of the family ideal by finding a home and replacing her hysterical mother with a warm, welcoming one, she also wants her story to end in marriage. On a related note, it's significant that several scholars have claimed the characters in the novel may be read as mythic archetypes. Reading the characters as archetypes echoes Hyman's claim that ritual enacts myth, and modern literature can be read as related to the expression of ritual. Quote, what such modern writers as Melville or Kafka create is not myth, but an individual fantasy expressing a symbolic action, equivalent to and related to the myth's expression of a public ritual, end quote. Dara Downey has argued that his explanation here urges the reader not to use literature as written myth itself, for myths cannot be recreated, but to read myth inside the literature and to find the subsequent meanings of the rituals enacted therein. I must agree with Downey here that the study of myth and ritual in the 1950s and 60s opens up multiple ways to interpret Jackson's writing, and in doing so also embraces its inherent ambiguity. Further, by weaving children's rhymes and the song O Mistress Mine into the ritualistic behaviors that Eleanor performs, both on the way to and inside Hill House, Eleanor not only invites the contagion of the house, she demonstrates the behavior of public ritual that recalls myth. The ballad lyrics, In delay there lies no plenty, do not merely express a volition. They signal to Hill House that Eleanor longs for a home and to be loved, the very things that Hill House promises in its contagious motherliness, but will surely never provide. Jackson's other works that touch upon apparitions and hauntings, such as the story The Bus, written in 1965, or The Tooth, published in the collection The Lottery in 1949, with their haunted objects, demonic characters, and warped sense of time, also depend heavily on the protagonist's perspective of their environment and interactions with others. As Colin Dickey has written, quote, "A haunted house is a memory palace made real, a physical space that retains memories that might otherwise be forgotten or that might remain only in fragments." End quote. While Dickey surmises that we can feel the ghost or interact with its presence, Jackson's haunted houses make the characters, and by extension, the reader, face the prospect that those fragments and their energy are transmitted to the inhabitants of and the visitors to the house in a contagious fashion that affect their behavior, their beliefs, and their choices. These fragments also engage with and take advantage of any ritualistic behaviors the characters enact, like Eleanor's desire for belonging in home and her repeated return to a song that expresses those desires. While it should be said that Jackson's haunted spaces are not limited to houses, her stories also feature countryside landscapes, cities, and even roads that are haunted. Houses are particularly important to her because they function as a locus of the supernatural and are the receptacle that contains memories of family interactions and secrets. The house is a contagious space that entraps her heroines, reminding them that a supernatural journey can be a welcome adventure, but may ultimately lead to the loss of adult identity for the protagonist, or even the loss of life. For Jackson, these are two sides of the same coin. The identity of the protagonist and her memories are subsumed into the house. Perhaps for Jackson's heroine to escape the classic literary ending of death or marriage, she must become economically and emotionally independent, like Theodora, or she will, like Eleanor, suffer at the hands of paranormal and supernatural forces that trap her in time loops, entice her to suicide, or contaminate her vision or version of reality by confusing memory and dreamlike, frightening apparitions. The use of ritual and music in Jackson's literary work deserves more attention from scholarship going forward. The relationship between her work and the work on ritual and music that her husband and their close friends, such as Ralph Ellison and Kenneth Burke, were doing, is also a subject for further study. In this, the 21st century, scholarship should endeavor to make clear the placement of Jackson's works in the broader landscape of literature and music that she was inspired by and with which she closely interacted. Thank you very much for listening to my lecture, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.